This is Dr. Jacobs. Instead of having in-person class today or Zoom, I decided to go ahead and record a video lecture for you all. That way we all stay safe and warm, and then you can watch the lecture and pause it as you need to at home. So we left off on introducing Freud, so let's go ahead and get back to this part of the lecture. I'll start from the beginning of this slide, and we'll try to move through it like we would in class. So this is Freud, or Sigmund Freud, because there's two Freuds that we're going to learn about. And he is known for something called psychodynamic theory. Sometimes you'll hear his theory referred to as psychoanalytic, which is actually what I've heard it referred to as more frequently, but both of these are the same. So again, we have Sigmund Freud. He was also the father of Anna Freud. He had several children actually, but she became a pretty prolific psychoanalyst for children as well. So if we were going to boil down Freud's theory into the least controversial parts of it, he would basically say that childhood experiences influence the rest of development. And when I asked the rest of the class, hey, do you believe that your childhood experiences influence the rest of your development? Almost everybody in the class agreed. And I think that makes common sense. Although there are other pieces of Freud's theory that we are less likely to like or be familiar with, if we boil it down, that's really a lot of what the theory is saying and something that I like to take away from his theory. So Freud has done a ton of different types of work within his psychoanalytic theory. Freud has his own personality theory. So Freud would say there's three different parts of our personality: the id, the ego, and the superego. And he would say that a lot of what makes our personality work is within our unconscious, and it's not something that we're very aware of. All right, so the id is basically the animal instincts that humans have. This could be aggression, it could be a number of things, but I like to think of this as, if this is not too far of a reference behind, but Sesame Street in Animal, the wild drummer puppet. And so the id is the wild, uncontrollable pieces of our identity that doesn't care about the rules, doesn't care, it's just animalistic instinct. Then I'm going to skip the ego and go to the superego first and explain that. So our superego then is our most purest ideals, the most moral self that we have. Some of this is unconscious, some of it's preconscious, but Freud would also say that this is also something that's very conscious, or within our realms of identifying within our life. And so we have our id, we have our superego. I like to think of these as kind of that cliche type example of where we have the devil on one shoulder and an angel on the other, and then they're both trying to get us to move their way. So if we're using that as a metaphor, it is that little devil on our shoulder, our superego is that little angel on our shoulder, and our ego is us trying to navigate the different wants and needs of the id and the superego. And so what Freud would say is that our ego negotiates between these two things, that it tries to get the desires of our id while making it more socially acceptable for the superego, and that these parts battle between one another. Freud also developed psychosexual stages, which was super controversial even in Freud's time, and even more so, I think, now. So, this is going to be a stage theory. Freud believed that these different psychosexual stages went in a very specific order at specific age ranges, and we're going to study them. I will not expect you to know the different psychosexual stages. I do want you to know that Freud is the one who developed these and that it's a stage theory, but I won't make you tell me which stage is which, because this is actually the only time within the course that we're going to go over these. So, again, it was very controversial, and it was very controversial because, according to Freud, that infants could be sexual beings, and that is something that most people today and before would cringe at because it's very icky. And so his theory focused on different pleasure seeking urges for different erogenous zones. He also was famous for the Oedipus and Electra complexes, where he believed that children would develop attractions to their opposite sex parent, and that they would try to eliminate the competition from their same sex parent. and it's kind of wild. So his stage theory went like this. So when we look at these different pieces, his first psychosexual stage was the oral stage from 0 to 18 months. Why do you think that is something that he believed occurred during this time period? So if you said it's because babies were breastfeeding or bottle feeding, that's exactly it. And if we look through some of these other types of stages, you can kind of see why he might have thought that way. He thought the developmental task for people from 0 to 18 months would be to move from being just a helpless infant toward being more of an autonomous person. And we'll see some of these ideas echoed later when we get to Eric Erikson, who was a student at Anna Freud, who is Freud's daughter. And so we can kind of see how these ideas developed. And although I don't necessarily agree with Freud on almost everything that he did, I can kind of see where it influenced Erickson's thinking, and that's a theory which I really like. And it's okay if you don't like Erickson's theory. Everybody has some of their favorites. That just happens to be one of mine. So if we look at then the next stage is 18 to 36 months. He called that the anal stage. And he said that's learning to exercise control over one's body, one's impulses, and other people. What's going on between these 18 and 36 months? So think to yourself, say it out loud before you move on. You can pause me. If you said children are typically learning potty training or toilet training, that's absolutely right. And in fact, sometimes you'll hear phrases that are still out, maybe not as common now. Sometimes students will know it, sometimes they won't, because sometimes Freudian language slips back into uh, current vernacular. But if you've ever heard someone say anal retentive, that someone's anal retentive, they typically say that's somebody who's very perfectionistic or conscientious. They have to have things in an exact way. That actually goes back to Freud's psychosexual stage of the anal stage. And so Freud would say if someone had parents who were really demanding and were very strict with their potty training, and a child learned precise control over things, that they would become anal retentive, that they'd have to have everything perfectionistic within control, without budging. And just the same with the oral stage, a common phrase that sometimes people will say, and I call the real world. I mean, I guess all of this is the real world, but they'll say oral fixation. That some people have oral fixations where they have to chew on things all the time, or suck on their thumb, or on candy. Um, Oral fixation actually is a term that stems directly from Freud's psychosexual stages as well. So there's tons of these. Like I said, you're not going to need to know each of these stages. What you do need to know is that he developed the psychosexual stages, that he is the one who developed the personality theory of the id, ego, and superego, and what those different parts of the personality are, and that he also developed the Oedipus and electric complexes. So, something that's interesting, Freud or Sigmund Freud, remember we have two of them. I have to remind myself of that. This is a learning edge for me. Freud introduced defense mechanisms, but he is not the one who fleshed out this theory. His daughter, Anna Freud, who is that child psychoanalyst that I told you about, actually fully fleshed out defense mechanisms. And so, defense mechanisms are ways that we cope with things that are threatening to our ego. And so, there's sometimes things about ourselves that we don't want to be true or don't want to believe are true. And these defense mechanisms are things that people do to cope so that their ego is not threatened. One of these defense mechanisms is denial, not accepting the truth or lying to yourself about something. There are people who will kind of be in denial about some of these things, and I'm sure you can think of an example. What's an example that you can think of where you were in denial? That's a lot of times what we'll hear about something that you didn't want to accept for truth. A common one that some people have is that in denial that one of their partners doesn't love them anymore. That can be a really tricky thing to do, or in denial if maybe you're actually not as good at something that you thought you were. That could be something that you're in denial with too. Another defense mechanism is called displacement. And if you've worked in retail, you've probably had this happen to you. This is when people take out their frustrations on a safer target. So, children of divorce often will act out on the parent that they feel safer with. So if there is a really bad situation in which a kid feels unsafe in one of their parents' homes, If they come back, they might be really terrible to the parent they actually feel safe to because they can't express those frustrations with the other parent. So in retail, if you've done this and just had someone who was just a jerk to you for no reason, it's very likely that they were displacing their frustrations or anger out on a safer target. So my husband worked at Starbucks for a really long time. And something he is very, very emotionally savvy with certain things. And something that he had done or he had taught me once is that sometimes when people are mean to you for no reason, it's actually has nothing to do with you or who you are as a person. And so, for example, when he was working one day, one guy was just being terribly mean to him. And he asked the guy, "Hey, are you doing okay?" And in a moment, in an instant, this man realized that he was taking his anger out on somebody who wasn't the problem. And the guy apologized and he said, "No, I understand what it's like to have a hard day." And he bought his drink for him. And so that is something that I've learned. If someone's not being kind to me, a lot of times I recognize that they might be taking out their frustrations on me, even though I have nothing to do with it, just because I am a safer person for them to do that with than someone else. But that doesn't necessarily make displacement okay, and it's okay to call it out, because sometimes people don't even realizing they're doing it. And I'm pretty sure that all of us are guilty of displacement in our lives at some point. So another one is projection. This is when you attribute unacceptable thoughts to others. So if you've ever been in a situation where someone has projected something onto you, this can be really painful. So, for example, if you are out there and you feel really insecure, let's say insecure about weight. So, a lot of times we'll see this with eating disorders. If someone feels really insecure about their weight and they are starving themselves, sometimes they'll attribute things to other people and their insecurities about their own looks onto other people. And I've seen this in practice, and it can be really painful. And people might not actually they don't know they're doing it. These are typically unconscious, so they're projecting some of these other things. Or like bullies when they project their vulnerability onto other people, or there was a show called Dance Moms a while back. I don't know if it's still a current show, but people projecting what their dreams were because they weren't able to achieve them within their life. One of my parents wanted me to be a lawyer and still wants me to be a lawyer, because they had dropped out of law school a long time ago, and that's just not for me. It was their dream, not mine. We also can see rationalization as a defense mechanism. This is when they justify their behavior by substituting acceptable reasons for less than acceptable real reasons. An example of this I can think of personally is I went to a school that had a lot of criminal activity within it. And I remember one of my friends blaming a woman. I guess he has more acquaintance, but blamed a woman that he stole her purse because she left her car unlocked. And he said she wanted me to steal her purse because if she didn't, she would have taken her purse with her or left her car locked. And so he blamed the victim. We see that a lot within our society, unfortunately, where people blame victims for other people's criminal behavior. And that's a defense mechanism because people don't want to see themselves as bad. They don't want to think, oh, maybe I'm not as good as I think I am. Then something else we find as a defense mechanism is reaction formation, and this is outwardly opposing something you inwardly desire but you find unacceptable. So sometimes we see this with people who oppose something like gay marriage, but they are secretly maybe may be gay or have those feelings, but because for whatever reason they find it unacceptable, could be religion, could be geographic region, could be whether it's urban, suburban, or rural communities. There's a whole bunch of worldviews, right, on what's acceptable and what's not. Um, they might outwardly oppose it when they secretly, unconsciously desire it, but they find it unacceptable for whatever reason. Another one's regression. So sometimes when We go through traumatic events. We regress back to a time when the world felt safer. Sometimes people can revert back to childhood behaviors. So if you've gone through something really traumatic and you start sleeping with a stuffed animal again, to snuggle it to feel safe, that is regressive. Some people will start sucking their thumbs again or just doing things that they would have done when the world may have been a safer place for them. We also have repression. So this happens when people push painful thoughts out of their consciousness and they actually don't remember it. They have a memory lapse. So they'll sometimes try to think about something else or completely block out entire years of their life because it was so painful and it threatens them. So they don't want to think it and push it into their subconscious, which can cause them a lot of problems later on. We also have sublimation. This is transforming unacceptable urges into more socially acceptable behavior. So, if you've ever been really, really angry at someone and you had all that physical energy, maybe going out for a run or going and getting a punching bag and punching that or doing something different. Um, or it could be someone's harmed you really bad. So then you write a book about it instead of being mean to that person. Just doing something that's more socially acceptable than being aggressive and harming others. All right, so those are defense mechanisms again. Anna Freud is the one who actually fleshed all of these out, even though Sigmund Freud is typically the one who's credited with it. He did mention the idea, but Anna Freud actually continued this work, and this is more hers. And so Anna Freud ended up being a teacher of Eric Erikson, who developed the psychosocial theory, which is also a stage theory. We will actually cover this theory across the entire semester. So this is just the beginning. And something that's interesting about this theory is that it was Eric Erikson's theory, but he also worked on this one with his wife, Joan Erickson, and she actually published a ninth stage after his death. So again, Eric Erikson studied underneath Anna Freud, who was Freud's daughter. So we can kind of see this scholarly lineage that people have. And we actually, there are little lineages that psychologists often keep to find out which great psychologists they've technically studied under, whose great, 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 great grand academic they are. And so we actually saw this really common within psychology where people would study particular theories and then they would go to different countries to study under different people. So actually, Sigma and Anna Freud were from Vienna, Austria, but they ended up having to uh, flee Vienna, Austria, and they went to London, where you can find the Freud Museum and things like that. Uh, there still to this day. And then Eric Erikson was also Jewish and fled Vienna and he went to the United States. And so Eric Erikson is actually not his real name. There's some folklore around what his real name was. So I'm not quite sure what his birth name was, but he ended up going by the moniker of Eric Erikson, which he kept for the rest of his life. And so much like Freud, Freud pretty much focused though on childhood and adolescence. Eric Erikson took a stage theory and developed it across the entire lifespan and says that not only just things that we go through as children influence our lifespan, but that we go through all of these challenges across our life and how we resolve them impact the rest of our development. And so we'll learn about each of these in more detail as we get within the chronological age of them. So we'll find here that there are some developmental phases here, right? So we have like infancy, toddlerhood, preschool is that early childhood age, school age is middle childhood, adolescence, young adulthood would be that early adulthood, middle adulthood, and late adulthood is the older adulthood. Those are developmental phases. Those are not Eric Erikson stages. Eric Erikson stages are during infancy, we find that the challenge is basic trust versus basic mistrust. That's what the stage theory or the stage is for Erickson's theory, basic trust versus basic mistrust. So he would say that the developmental task at this age is to either learn to trust the world or mistrust the world, and that people typically develop that off of how their caregivers take care of them during infancy. And so, like I said, we'll go through these in more detail and so, like I said, Eric Erikson expanded Freud's theory to go across the entire lifespan. And so it had been a really long time that I believed that lifespan development was relatively new. But if we look at some of these theories, we do have theories that went across the entire lifespan, which is congruent with what we learn about Balt's perspectives on what lifespan development includes. Erickson would also say that we follow this epigenetic principle that we develop through unfolding our personality in predetermined stages, and that our environment and surrounding culture influence how we progress through these stages. So, for example, from 0 to 1, what was Freud's oral stage was Eric Erickson's trust versus mistrust, which still does with parenting. But that's only one piece of it, right? So not only do parents have to feed their children, they have to clean them, they have to make sure we're changing their diapers, that we're providing tummy time and social development. And all of these things go into like comforting a child when they're hurt. These things go into them being able to trust or mistrust the world. It's our very first, what I'm going to call schema, which is borrowing from a different theory that we'll learn about later. But it becomes our model for the way that we think about the world and our relationships with other people. So, yes, there are certain things that we have predetermined stages. Like we are dependent on other people from 0 to 1. That is genetic. But the way that the environment that we're in, our surrounding culture will influence whether or not we can trust or mistrust people if our needs are getting met at that stage. Again, his spouse, Joan Erickson, completed his work after he died. I actually purchased that book. Erickson writes really interestingly. And so I've kind of actually struggled to get through this book, but that's hopefully one of my goals this semester. All right, so that's where we're going to leave off for today. I think that's enough for a lecture. Make sure you're taking notes that you get this done before 9 a.m. on January, let's double check this, 28th, 2026. You'll get your one attendance point for doing this lecture. Remember, you have to watch it on one monitor screen. You cannot split your screen to take notes. That you have to keep it on the regular speed. You can't speed it up or slow it down. You just got to keep it where it's at. You can pause it if you need to, but just make sure you get through this, and we'll be prepared to continue class on Wednesday as long as the weather cooperates with us. Awesome. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe and warm.